Hello and welcome to Excavations here at Varn Blog, a monthly book group. And today we have with us PH, Brandon, Yorn, Cody, Gerard, and somebody else was up here. Maybe that is me. And those you don't know, this is a panel constructed from people in the Varn Blog Discord who wanted to read a book with me. And we are reading The Accursed Share, Part 1, Section 1, the theoretical introduction. And I'm going to turn it over to you guys with a brief introduction to the author, George Bataille. Was born in 1879 and died in 1962. He is a French philosopher and general intellectual who worked in philosophy, literature, sociology, anthropology, and the history of art. He was a pervert. A lot of his key texts that you might be more familiar with in literature are about eroticism, mysticism, and death. And he wrote a ton of books. This is considered the most theoretically rigorous in some ways. And maybe one day I'll cover his life more because I'm reading his biography right now, translated from French, and it's pretty wild. Some things to note about Bataille. He's influenced by Hegel, but his Hegel comes way of Kojève. It's not pure Hegel. He's influenced by Nietzsche. He's influenced by Marcel Mauss, Freud, and Marx are huge influences. He can't really said to be rigorous Freudian Marxist anthropologist or anything like that. Walter Benjamin accused him of being a pre-fascist aesthete. So that's fun. But he was also big on defending Nietzsche against appropriation by the Nazis. So, you know, his influence is all over the place. Influential on post-structuralism. He's influential on the CCRU that Mark Fisher and Nagastani and Nick Landau came out of. And he founded the secret society and was really fascinated by human sacrifice. I don't really know what else to talk about. I mean, Lacan stole his wife. Which he was born and died the same years as William Faulkner. He's a weird guy. All right. So this is his attempt at a book of political economy, and we're reading the most abstract part of it. When we get into the later parts of this book, it's going to be interesting because we're going to have to actually parse whether or not his understanding of history is like even remotely true. And that might get complicated.
I do feel like even
go ahead.
Early on, even he makes a couple claims that I'm just like, I think that's a little dubious.
Yeah, there's some dubious overclaims. I mean, we haven't got to the section on Tibetan Buddhism, which I'm sure is gonna like just me lecturing for an hour about what's probably wrong in that. But also,
didn't you say something like that there was no major war like from 1814 to 1914 or something like that?
Yeah.
That I was like, oh, so like all that Napoleonic shit, I guess, doesn't count because you're French, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah. No major war for you.
Yeah.
And his citation for that was himself 10 pages later.
I mean, like when he talks about Lamaism, which by that he means Tibetan Buddhism as an unarmed society, that's pretty funny too. But nonetheless, I don't know. He's at least as rigorous as Foucault. All right. So I also want to point out that he tries to go through more history in this little volume 1 of this book than Marx does. So like we try to get an attempt at a general trans-historical theory of a political economy in approximately 20 pages. So it's fun.
Yeah, we were just discussing part 1. Do I remember that correctly, or did that get expanded
today?
Okay.
We're not going into part 2. Part 1's fairly short.
Yeah.
Part 2, I'm gonna have to like get out all my books on Buddhism and Islam to make sure that like he's saying anything remotely even kind of true.
Yeah. I mean, with some of this, it's like some of the stuff, there's data about the actual nature of like Aztec society that like hasn't been actually like widely understood outside of some really niche circles until like the last 20 years even, I would say. So I could give him a little bit of slack that like, yeah, some of his stuff on the Aztecs is probably going to be bullshit because people were still just reading like stuff that now we are like, yeah, these guys' accounts are wrong. Like we only recently understand anything from like actual like indigenous sources on this.
Yeah. I mean, didn't we just figure out for sure that there really was cannibalism in Mexica society? Like that we've actually now verified it. It wasn't just made up. But the level is totally unclear.
Yeah.
It's but the Aztec part's actually interesting because living in Mexico, I got obsessed with the Mexica and the larger Aztec Ute-Paiute connection and the migration and how the Spaniards turned all the other indigenous against them and how that went for everybody. And also there's just stuff that's just fundamentally misguided from this time period. So, okay. I'm just going to read this very first paragraph because you guys have, if you've ever done a book club with me, I'm a close reader and I find this stuff kind of interesting. When is it necessary to change an automobile tire, open an abscess, or plow a vineyard? It is easy to manage a quite limited operation. The elements on which the action is brought to bear are not completely isolated from the rest of the world, but it's possible to act on them as if they were. One can complete the operation without once needing to consider the whole, of which the tire, the abscess of the vineyard, is nevertheless an integral part. The changes brought about to do not perceptibly alter the other thing, nor does the ceaseless action from without have an appreciable effect on the conduct of the operation. But things are different when we consider a substantial economic activity, such as the production of automobiles in the United States, are a fortiori when the question of economic activity, when it is a question of economic activity in general. I mean, the thing is though, like plow vineyards and economic activity, isn't it? I'm actually was confused about that distinction. I hate to be like that pedantic, but why else would you plow a vineyard? I guess if you're just growing the grapes for use values, then I guess it's not. But go ahead.
But I do think like the concept of a vineyard implies that you're not just like plowing grapes for your own use value. Like
right.
Just the concept of a vineyard as a general like size. I do think his like conception of wealth and economy just from the very beginning is a little bit skewed in that way.
So as we go through this, I'm going to be like, this is the problem, and this is a problem I see in arch nemesis of the show, David Graeber. As we, the longer I do stuff on anthropology, the more bitter I am on David Graeber. But anyway, where
I will
you try
say,
to go ahead.
I was just going to say, with regards to what he says about plowing a vineyard, I think that to him, the thing is that he would conceive that as like he's talking about like the particular physical act of like exerting your muscles to plow, as opposed to a general act of like the construction of an automobile and all of its parts as this bigger process is, I think, how he would distinguish it. Like he's talking about the idea that I don't think that that's necessarily itself a valid distinction, but I think he's drawing on this kind of French theory that's maybe also a bit Hegelese, like this idea that there's like the particular concrete activity of doing something versus like the general economic activity of it. Whereas like he's not talking about like the management and growth and creation of wine. He's talking about plowing a vineyard is kind of, I think, what he would maybe try and like say he's talking about.
Is this like the distinction between like your individual labor and then abstracted labor on a societal level?
Yeah, I mean, maybe he obviously doesn't use that Marxist terminology at least at this point. I know he talks about Marx later in this book, but just kind of that like he does have like this thing where he keeps saying like, oh, like there's the way energy and stuff appears, the idea of utility appears like to the person, but like there's energy and like societal economy, and that's like kind of its own like level. And I think he's like trying to set up that kind of level that he wants to claim he's like moving between.
So,
well,
my inclination is to blame Kojave, which I'm going to do a lot as we talk about the book. Go ahead, Brandon.
Oh no, I'm just saying yes. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, I think it was more, these are conceptually small things, changing a tire, plowing a vineyard, as opposed to all of the operations of building all the automobiles in the US.
Right.
That's what I read out of it, was he was saying this is a very particular physical thing that anybody can understand, as opposed to all the logistics and all the laborers building all the automobiles, very complex, too much for any one person to really truly get a grasp on. And then of course comparing that to the economy overall.
Yeah. I think, I mean, to get into it a little bit, there is actually, even without blaming Kojave here, there is actually a distinction to be made from sensuous activity through the emergence of sensuous activity into the abstraction. So, for example, to talk about auto production as opposed to even building an automobile is to talk about an abstracted labor process versus a real labor process. And that does get to some of the things that we could talk about, like labor in specific, as in physical exertion versus labor in general versus labor in abstract. But this is still not totally that clear. So between the production of automobiles and the general movement of the economy, the interdependence is rather clear. But the economy is taken as a whole is usually studied as if it were a matter of an isolatable system of operation. Production and consumption are linked together, but considered jointly, it does not seem difficult to study them as one might study an elementary operation relatively independent of that which it is not. The method is legitimate, and science never proceeds differently. However, economic science does not give results of the same order as physics studying first a precise phenomenon, then all studyable phenomena as a coordinated whole. Economic phenomena are not easy to isolate, and their general coordination is not easy to establish. So it is possible to raise this question concerning them. Shouldn't productive activity as a whole be considered in terms of the modifications it receives from the surroundings or brings about in its surroundings? In other words, isn't there a need to study the system of new production and consumption within a much larger framework? In sciences such as such problems ordinarily have an academic character, but economic activity is so far-reaching that no one will be surprised if the first question is followed by another, less abstract ones. In overall industrial development, are there not social conflicts and planetary wars? In the global activity of men, in short, are there not causes and effects which will appear only provided that the general data of the economy are studied? We would be able to make ourselves masters of such dangerous activity, and one we could not abandon in any case without having grasped the general consequences. Should we not, given the constant development of economic forces, pose the general problem that are linked to the movement of energy on the globe? These questions allow one to glimpse both the theoretical meaning and practical importance of the principles they introduce. So we have to talk about everything holistically. Is that what we're taking from that initial section there?
At least in the circumstances of the economy, there's something that needs to be accounted for generally that can't be determined through isolated incidents.
Yeah, so take that, econometrics.
I do think that's probably, at least to a certain extent, I don't quite think that he's right in the direction that he goes, but I think there's something there about saying, yeah, we can't, in the way that like economists will try to like isolate a single country's economic like industrial output and everything and try to make large broad claims about how an economy is doing on a national level. I just don't think that's how the economic system works. But I also don't know if that's what he's saying yet.
Yeah, when we think about, for example, GDP, I could dump a ton of investment resources into, I don't know, useless AI products that don't do a goddamn thing. And that would temporarily boost GDP, as does laying off workers to create liquidity for stock buybacks, even if it's at the expense of the productive capacity of the company. That will temporarily not boost GDP, but it'll boost stock valuation. But again, in the long haul, that actually starts destroying the company. You can see General Motors is actually the example of this. And basically, after General Motors did it, everyone does it, but we don't look at the fact that General Motors is basically not a functioning company anymore. So, I mean, it still exists, but you know what I mean? So, and the way economists will try to isolate things is funny, and also what they'll bracket out. Like, when you build econometric models, for example, it's okay to bracket out like time or you can just say, oh, we're just going to bracket this out for now for this model to be modelable. But then like the what you're modeling has, like, for example, this is from Joseph Heath. In traditional equilibrium economics, every step that you approach to equilibrium will lead to more efficiency. And you bracket out the assumption that there'd be complications to that. But Joseph Heath actually works out, and he's not like a Marxist or anything. He's not a particularly radical economist or philosopher, that there is literally no reason to assume that there is linear correspondence between increased equilibrium numbers and efficiency until you hit peak. And in fact, there might be flows and valleys empirically in that, depending on the field, that make that irrelevant. Now, I'm a Marxist. I don't even believe in that shit in the first place. But you can see here, like, that's a problem for the economists, but it's also interesting because they're only dealing in extractions. And if we talk about today, when we deal with like the way even say leftists talk about the economy, they talk about the economy it's like as if they're natural enclosures, like within a state. And part of that has to do with the nature of currency, which is a natural enclosure within a state, kind of, except not for USD.
Yeah, except the USD,
euro,
yeah.
Or the euro, or the yuan, or sometimes Swiss francs. All right, but in general, they're natural. It is a national enclosure. But in reality, we know that, like, and I have this debate with MMTers all the time, and so you guys have heard me say it many times, but like Venezuela, for example, can't force the world oil market to accept its currency because it doesn't produce enough or finish enough in the production process to demand people buy its currency to pay them. Whereas the larger states can within certain limits, and those limits are not entirely clear. It has to do with like forex basis and stuff like that. This is just an example of like the way in which a lot of the way we talk about the economy as bracketed individual incidents, can be very confusing, and you're dealing at a level of extreme abstraction. But to get back to the book, let's just go to the next section, because I mean, I actually agree. I despite the fact I don't love the vineyard thing, because it kind of confuses this point about economics. I actually agree with this first point. Like, we often talk about this stuff as if it's an isolated incident, and we really can't. Although it's interesting, at first sight, it is easy to recognize in the economy and the production and use of wealth a particular aspect of terrestrial activity regarded as a cosmic phenomena. What? Because like, we're already getting hints of where Bataille's going to get weird.
It's French philosophy right away.
Yeah, I mean, it's weirder than even like post-structuralism. Like, post-structuralism is alienating because I like to invent neologisms all the time. But like, this is weirder than that. A movement is produced on the surface of the globe that results from the circulation of energy at this point in the universe. The economic activity of man appropriates this movement, making use of the resulting possibilities for certain ends. But this movement has pattern and laws with which, as a rule, those who use them and depend on them are unacquainted. Thus, the question arises: in general determination of the chain of circulating in the biosphere altered by man's activity, or rather, isn't the latter's intention deviated by the determination of which he is ignorant, which it overlooks and cannot change? Without waning, I will give an inescapable answer. Man's disregard for the material basis of his life still causes him to err in a serious way. Humanity exploits given material resources, but by restricting them as it does to the resolution of an immediate difficulties it encounters, a resolution with which he has hastily had to define as an ideal, it assigns to forces and employs an end which they cannot have. Beyond our immediate ends, man's activity, in fact, pursues the useless and infinite fulfillment of the universe. Of course, the error that results from so complete a disregard does not just concern man's claim to lucidity. It is not easy to realize one's own ends if one must, in trying to do so, carry out a movement that surpasses them. No doubt these and this movement may not be entirely irreconcilable, but if these two terms are not irreconcilable, we must cease to ignore one of them. Otherwise, our works quickly turn into catastrophe. I will begin with a basic fact. It's a living organism in a situation determined by the play of energy on the surface of the globe ordinarily receives more energy than is necessary for maintaining life. Excess energy, wealth. Okay, already we got a definition of wealth that's just foreign to Marxist. All right, like, he's not talking about wealth as Marx defines wealth as the store of all possible capital, like, kind of. Like, this is really clear in Key to the Girth of the program when he actually points out that labor does not produce all wealth. All you have to do is see something and not do anything with it, and that's still wealth because you control the access to it, right? Like, that's his point there. And thus, we have to take the natural world seriously as a source of wealth because it's the source of use values. And that's irregardless of labor. Although one can argue in a Smithian, Ricardian sense that you have to do labor to valorize the wealth. But here we have something different. Wealth, it's just excess energy. All right. Which can be used for the growth of a system, i.e. an organism. So we actually have something closer to a cybernetic, like, this is larger than political economy. Like talking about organisms as systems is kind of a almost proto-cybernetic move. What do you guys think about that? I'm gonna just let you guys talk because I'll talk all day if you don't.
I'll start. I feel like the beginning, like talking about the excess energy and then defining that as wealth, it's making two movements, and the cybernetic one is actually a really good connection as well. But I saw the movement as like wealth is now like we have this definition of wealth, but now we're moving that definition away into profit, and then we're decoupling the term profit from monetary and economic cycles entirely and abstracting it out to just be an entire system. And I think like that's where I got stuck, and I think the like connecting it to cybernetic theory has like helped connect that a little bit more.
So I'm not too familiar with cybernetic theory, so I'm just wondering, like, does it have like a concept of excess energy within it?
No,
I mean, I don't know that there's not necessarily one.
No, there's not a singular concept. Like, it has a concept that basically all systems down to the idiomotor effect and mechanics function in similar ways. So you can model complex functionings in people similar to the way you can model complex functionings in machines, because they're all basically energy processing systems. But there's not a singular conception of like energy movements within cybernetics. Like there was many. So
they'll have like notions of outputs in systems, and they'd probably be able to say like, for this particular system, there's a certain amount of stuff that you can categorize as waste for this process, insofar as it has an output that's like going out and you can't use it anymore in that system until it's retransformed somehow in another system. But I think some proper, quote unquote, proper cyberneticists, if they read this, like the idea of like a true excess or waste in the way that like, or sacrifice in the way that Bataille kind of indicates it, they would kind of like be frustrated with the notion of something being like as absolutely wasted and non-useful in the way that he describes it. I don't think that they would know what he's trying to get at with that for the purpose of like analyzing a system. Because like he kind of later on, we'll get into it, he does kind of acknowledge that like he's not necessarily saying that like from the perspective of the whole that energy can truly be destroyed. Like he's not trying to go against, you know, the principles of physics that energy can be like made or destroyed or whatever. He does kind of say it's like from particular perspectives that it gets wasted. But I think that's still like a 20th century cyberneticist who's trained in like engineering or whatever, when they read him talk about waste and like uselessness in the way that he talks about it, I don't think that they would know how to translate that into like cybernetic formal terms.
No, they wouldn't. It's too anthropocentric, honestly. Like, because from the cybernetic perspective, it's only a waste to certain to one part of the system, not to the system as a whole.
And this ties too into his notion of sovereignty, which he explicitly says is like a human. Like he talks about humans are at like this summit where they gain this like feeling perspective of sovereignty that is tied to this idea of waste. That's like almost like a phenomenological like type thing. It's like hard to kind of nail down what exactly he's like talking about.
But we already have a problem here in that, like, we're talking about him in terms of the human, and it seems anthropocentric, but he's making this claim for, like, all life, period.
Yeah, he's making the jump from, like, if our economic system has this excess thing that we can call profit or wealth, and which is, he's already making a jump in, like, definitional terms there. He's then, like, ascribing that to all abstracted, like, human condition and societal conditions.
Yeah, well, actually, I would even go further. He's applying it to all conditions whatsoever.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah,
because like excess energy wealth can be used for growth of a system, i.e., an organism. He's not just talking about people. Like,
yeah, he literally talks about like algae and stuff at certain points, and how this like applies to even like asexual reproduction, or like reproduction that doesn't require like expanding into a new, like a properly new organism and things. Like it's a very like the most, he's trying to get like the most abstract you can kind of get about like the of a concept of like energy as like flows of like, you can kind of see he's got this like French vitalist thing. Like he kind of has like something in that vein of like Bergson and stuff like that. Like life will just expand, and life is tied to like this, the way that energy like fills up a system and then has to break out into this explosive new like thing that just keeps building and building and going somewhere, like until something forces it to like not be able to anymore.
Yeah, so this is a vitalist rule. It's more than a human rule. Let's continue. The poverty of organisms are limited systems and the excess wealth of living nature. I'm not going to read all of this, but I'm going to read a lot of it. Minds accustomed to seeing the development of productive forces as an ideal end of activity refuse to recognize that energy, which constitutes wealth, must ultimately be spent lavishly without return, and that the series of profitable operations that absolutely no other effect than squandering of profits. To affirm that it is necessary to dissipate a substantial portion of energy produced, sending it up in smoke, is to go against judgments that form the basis of rational economy. We know cases where wealth has to be destroyed, coffee thrown into the sea, but these scandals cannot reasonably be offered as examples to follow. They are the acknowledgement of an impotence, and no one could find in them the image and essence of wealth. Indeed, involuntary destruction, such as the disposal of coffee overboard, has in every case the meaning of failure. It is experienced as a misfortune. In no way can it be presented as desirable, and yet it is a type of operation without which there is no solution. When one considers the totality of productive wealth on the surface of the globe, it is evident that the products of this wealth must be employed for productive ends only insofar as the living organism that is economic mankind can increase its equipment. It is not entirely, neither always nor indefinitely possible. A surplus must be dissipated through deficit operations. The final dissipation cannot fail to carry out the movement that animates terrestrial energy. This is a weird ass way to get to the Marxist argument for overproduction, but I think that is part of what it's doing, question mark. What do you guys think about it? I've been like sitting with this for a little while, because I'm like, okay, so we have to get rid of energy because reasons. And that is the opposite of what economists say because they're dumb. What else are we taking from this?
Just one point is, reading this after what we just discussed, I do think that maybe this clarifies that he does seem to want to use the term wealth specific to like human ends. Like he is talking about that for like production, but he's trying to be like within his broader point about like excess energy. He's just saying like wealth is an example of excess energy from the perspective of the system that is like the human economic like thing of goods and stuff, is I think partly what he's doing here.
I mean, and
so I don't think he wants to use the term wealth when he's talking about like cellular reproduction or something. I think maybe he's not going to use those words.
But he's basically arguing that wealth accumulation is a process that happens in nature with all surplus. Yeah? Do you think that seems to be kind of what he's arguing? And that it has to be destroyed periodically because we'd be overloaded with it otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's arguing that this is like a general phenomenon. I just think terminologically, I think it's clear here that he wants to use the term wealth specifically as an anthropomorphic variation of this broader, like he's just using the term wealth when he's like, I'm going to talk about like human material goods. But he thinks that those are subject to the rules of excess energy that's not seen when you look at them as like particular, like when he goes into stuff about, we think of them in terms of like particular utilitarian ends, and then you lose this broader thing that man is subject to, but we don't understand it kind of like thing.
Right. I mean, basically, he makes the argument that we kind of implied in the beginning, that economists don't look at the broader movement of the economy because that would point out some things that would be hard for us to grasp. Therefore, we look at everything in terms of basically utilitarian singular functions. Economic science merely generalizes the isolated situation. It restricts its object to operations carried out with a view to a limited end, that of economic man. It does not take into consideration a play of energy that has no particular end limits. The play of living matter in general involved in the movement of light, in which is a result. Yeah, that's vitalist, by the way. No, who refers to light as living matter? On this, the choice is limited to how wealth is to be squandered. It is to the particular living being, or to limited populations of living beings, that the problem necessarily presents itself. But man is not just separate being that the contents with the living world and with other men for his share of resources. The general movement of that's a word I've never seen before. Exduation of waste of living matter impels him, and he cannot stop it. Moreover, being at the summit, his sovereignty in the living world identifies him with this movement. It destines him in the privileged way to the glorious operation, to useless consumption. If he denies this, as he is constantly urged to do by the consciousness of necessity, of an indignance inherent to the separate beings, which are constantly short of resources, which are nothing but eternally needy individuals, his denial does not alter the global movement of energy in the least. The latter cannot accumulate limitlessly in the productive forces. Eventually, like a river into the sea, it is bound to escape and be lost to us. So I've been told this was a Marxist-friendly text, and reading it today, I'm like, well, there are. He has phrased some things that we have in Marxism in weird ways, but it's in there. But then parts of this seem to be almost a direct attack. Like the stuff about productive forces and whatnot seem to be a pretty direct attack. Interestingly, Bataille flirted with Marxist-Leninism for a little while, I think in the 20s. But
around the time that he flirted with fascism.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. So, you know, he went around. He was basically like a Zoomer teenager on Twitter in the aught teens, you know, just changing ideologies as he needed to be.
Every day. Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think he's like explicitly trying to make this claim, but I feel like just this section entirely is like making it's hinting to Marxist overproduction. And I think he like directly says in the preface, I don't actually want to talk that much about overproduction, but I am going to like talk about it.
Right.
But then it feels like he's trying to like universalize specifically like overproduction in the capitalist system as like a natural phenomenon that occurs through all time in all organisms.
Right. That seems to be what he's doing. He seems to be arguing that it's not overproduction because of the chaos of the, you know, the quote anarchy of the market, unquote. That this is what life does, period. End of discussion. Not just people, but life altogether.
Yeah. Feels explicitly anti-Marxist in a sense.
Yeah. I now kind of get why he was obsessed with human sacrifice. But anyway. We could see this as a manifestation of him being obsessed with human sacrifice. Speak. Go ahead.
I know that he does, like later in this book, he starts talking about the USSR and stuff, and he goes more into like how he thinks that his theory is inspired by and related to Marx. And he kind of does try to present a like, I think that the Soviets get Marx wrong in their focus on like this idea that it's just about advancing production. And I think that one of the things that's misleading is like with the idea of like overproduction, like, because his point isn't like you should like, because near the end of the book he just like outright says like, here's why my theory means we need communism. Like he does say that like explicitly, basically. And he kind of tries, I think he does try to present this idea that like it's not really overproduction in the sense that like we're not managing this well enough and we need it, like, because he's like no, like this is just what the system is, like it just does this. The question is, are we like wasting this stuff in the best way possible, right?
Yeah,
and his like idea is
waste
like
it in cooler ways.
like because his point isn't like, oh, we need to like slow down production. His point is like, we need to stop thinking that we should just like make production better and better so that we're like making stuff just more efficiently to the point that it's all being useful. His point is like, yeah, like production might still keep going, but the question is, are we being unusefully good enough with all the stuff?
Yeah.
Right? Like, are we able to like luxuriously spend the energy in this way that like breaks out of like that system? And I think that's what gets like so paradoxically hard to grasp with what his like reversal is, because he's not really talking about trying to just like manage the economy better to be like less wasteful, like because he kind of doesn't think that that is coherent at all.
I think you've clearly like read a little bit more of this. Does he go into more of like what a definition of usefulness is?
No.
That's yeah. I've read a fair amount of like Bataille, more of his like weird surrealist stuff. Like it's kind of shocking reading him trying to be this like plain spoken almost, but his sense of like use and uselessness, I think it has a very strong kind of mixture of like, again, like German idealism and some kind of like Nietzschean thing.
He's got a whole another
obvious
book about how being useful sucks.
Yeah. Because like his idea of like art as non-useful is like a very particular like kind of French theoretical term that I initially got into reading Bataille. I have like an Asafel like tattoo. Like I was really into him. Like that was the part of him that I knew that I always thought was fun, just because I thought it's like trolly. Like when you're in art school and everyone's talking about how important their art is, I always like to throw out the time and be like, no, it's useless. That's what's good about it. It's just a big fucking waste. Like
Duchamp was right. It's both pointless, ugly, and stupid.
Yeah, like
that's and that's what makes it great. I mean, I also think we do. I will interject here. I am gonna like talk a little bit about his weird ass version of materialism, because he almost predates Althusser's returning to Lucretius for aleatory materialism. You know, the materialism of the encounter and the materialism of the swerve, like Althusser weird shit. But it's even weirder than that, because he thought that mainstream materialism was actually a subtle form of idealism, and that you needed a concept of active base matter that destabilizes all foundations, and that any materialism that had a strict definition or rationalizations would not be able to do this. So materialism was more almost Gnostic in our ability to like grasp its weird movement of material, which I think is also part of what he's doing with energy. And it's partially based on mystic bullshit and partially based on early 20th century understandings of energy physics. So
yeah, it also has it also, I think, comes from, there's this weird split in like the neo-Kantians in Germany. They look at like the idea of the like there's like the noumena, right? Like there's the phenomena, which is like what we can actually like experience, and then there's the noumena, which like you can't even say what it is because it's what is completely outside of like the realm of like human capacity to structurally like encounter and understand and think about.
The noumena is like pure qualia, so you can't even talk about it.
It's pure it's not even experiential. Like it's it's what's outside of anything that the human cognitive capacities like can encounter. And so like the German post-Kantians look at this and they go, this concept is actually kind of useless and it doesn't tell us anything. So we're all going to either rework it into like being like a vague form of the scientific inquiry, or we're going to just jettison it because we don't think it makes sense. In France, this idea like gets more and more worked into like these kind of mystical turns. So like that's why Bataille also has this weird fixation on like limits, not just in terms of like this kind of semi-economic like systems theory version where it's about like systems have limits and then they overtake them and growth and stuff. He also has this idea of limit where he like, this is why he's like, let's do human sacrifice and take drugs and have orgies and like worship death, is that he has this idea of that like you can phenomenologically like reach a point where your mind categories like start to break down. And he's like, this is like you reach a point where you have a limit where you're almost getting into the noumenal and having an experience of what is noumenal. And he fixates on this kind of idea that like the material world is itself so active and disruptive that an actual experience of it is like impossible, but it requires you to go to a point of limit where your actual ability to like consciously categorize stuff just falls apart, is kind of his approach. Like it has this very mystical like conception of what the limit even is. But it's also why it's so weird that in this book he talks actively about like trying to consciously understand and use waste. Like he has this kind of weirdly Promethean idea of like, this book is going to help us understand this process, and then once mankind understands like how nature's energy stuff works, we'll be able to like orient our activity around it. And it's so weird reading him say this, because in like all the other Bataille shit, he's like, no, you can't even, rational thought doesn't even work, man. Like you can't even do that. You need to like go and sit in a cave and like have a mental breakdown. So I don't know why he suddenly decided he could change it.
Well, he does address that. Like in the preface, he literally says he's like, a book that nobody wants, that nobody knows what it's about, and that if the author were to follow its logic, wouldn't write it.
Yeah, it's a fun. This book is wild. And I mean, we're just on the. I mean, what is not on this, but if you actually know, let me see, does it call it this anywhere in the book? This volume has a name in French. Yep, they don't call it anywhere. The volume is called Consumption in French, and then volume 2 is the history of eroticism, and volume 3 is sovereignty. And volume 2 and 3 is one book. And I actually don't know why Zone Books published like this slim volume and then put 2 and 3 together in a massive volume. I don't quite get that, but that's just me. All right, so
I think it's just that volume 2 and volume 3 are unfinished, but this one was actually published.
Where have we seen that before?
Yeah.
Anyway.
One thing that I just popped into my head is regarding his like discussion of use. I don't know, like uselessness does have kind of a big question mark because he kind of intentionally wants it to be like almost not definable, because I think he kind of uses the term use almost as in anything that's like an intentional use value.
Yeah.
Like anything that you're like, I am going to use this for a specific end is useful. So I think that the kind of idea of like uselessness is sort of like, it has to be vague because he's trying to say it's whatever can't be like consciously oriented towards with a purpose almost, you know?
Everything's means there is no ends.
Yeah. He has like that bit later where he says that it can be like, you can have like acceptable, more or less acceptable, like useless waste, but you can't have like a rationalized waste. Like as in like, you can't have like rationally wanted to waste it, you know, like.
So fuck you, Weber. I don't know, man. When I was reading this, I felt like I was listening to one of my Marxist friends drop DMT, and then like after they went to a physics lecture, and then try to combine it all together, because when I was 20 and drinking too much in grad school, I would do that kind of shit, but I haven't published any of it ever, and I'm not going to, for reasons that are obvious, because it's insane. But I mean, I think you do have to grasp at this, like there's this weird vitalism here, and there is an attempt to figure out. I mean, what is interesting about this is that I think he is trying to like defend communism, but in a way that I think more than just Soviet Marxists would reject. Like, because one of the things that you get here is like, I do think this is a transhistorical theory, and you know how we Marxists feel about that. Like, it's just like different systems work differently, man.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, war as considered as a catastrophic expenditure of excess energy. Incomprehension does not change the final outcome in the slightest. We can ignore or forget the fact that the ground we live on is little other than a field of multiple destructions. Our ignorance only has this incontestable effect. It causes us to undergo that we could bring about in our own way if understood. It deprives us of the choice of exudation that might suit us. Above all, it consigns men and their works to catastrophic destructions. Blah, blah, blah. These excesses of life force, which locally block the poorest economy, are in fact the most dangerous factors of ruination. Hence, relieving the blockage was always, if in the darkest region of the consciousness, the object of feverish pursuit. Ancient societies found relief in festival. Some erected admirable monuments which had no useful purpose. We use the excess to multiply services to make life smoother, and we are led to reabsorb part of it by increasing leisure time. But indeed, diversions have always been inadequate. Their existence in excess, nevertheless, in certain respects, has perpetually doomed multitudes of human beings and great quantities of useful goods to the destruction of wars. Now, I know if you have listened to some of the more vulgar Marxists, including former friends of mine, who will tell you that the decline in the rate of profits is why we always have wars, to reset our overproduction. And that they also talk about it almost conspiratorially, as if like everyone knows that's why we got to have a war. This is weirdly close to that, except it's less conspiratorial, oddly. Like if this rhymes with ideas you may have heard Marxists say, I think there is a reason why. It's not totally foreign.
Well, I think, yes, it's not conspiratorial, but this is when we start getting into a lot of the transhistoricalness, I find,
Right.
especially also in the next paragraph, because, like, how are we defining what's excess in some of these ancient societies versus, modern societies? And you're talking about, like, increase in leisure and services, but that's a more modern phenomenon, obviously, comparatively, unless you were, like, among the super wealthy in more ancient societies. And then,
I mean, excess in leisure or services in ancient societies was generally slaves or serfs.
Yeah.
So.
Exactly.
Anyway, go ahead.
And then, well, I was going to just do one quick addendum to this. Like, well, okay, so he has no theory of development. So how do we get the use of using up this excess in these older societies? And then, starts talking about, okay, well, now we have this significant industrial activity. Well, how does that happen? How does the excesses get properly harnessed to get there, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Recent history is the result of soaring growth of industrial activity, as you mentioned. He just kind of, it happened, whatever. At this prolific movement restrained from martial activity. PH, do you find this? I mean, you read more French theory than me. Do you find this common in fringe theory, because I have superficially seen this idea that, you know, I mean, you see it in Foucault, that basically like these periodizations just kind of happen and they're radically different from each other, but we don't have we don't have like a operative theory about how they move and change.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been reading as much French theory in the last like 7 years or so, but I do think that there is kind of a tendency. I mean, it's not exclusively French. I mean, obviously, like people like Hegel also have these kind of like weird, like self-contained conceptualizations of like ancient society and then this society. Like Hegel, of course, is trying to make a claim that he has the key to how they all flow from one to the next through like idealizations movement or whatever. And the French tend to be a little like, yeah, a little more like vague about like the breaks that happen. You get this kind of weird, like, yeah, there's like this development, but there's also this Bachelardian, you know, break where like the change in the conceptualization isn't a progress. It's this just like radical overturning that just becomes something else. I mean, in this case, I don't know. I mean, he technically, in part one, he's still kind of saying that he's not going into historical data yet. So he's just saying, this is my theory about why this is important. So he's not necessarily claiming to go into why, like he is leaving the rest of the book to be about him claiming like how he's going to analyze these specific societies in their own like part. And I do think that he does have a weird, I think he thinks there is something kind of different about industrial society. Like, even though he's claiming that he has a general means of analyzing, I don't think he necessarily thinks that the way that like waste and activity and the specific forms of economic activity are just the same across all of them in terms of like what humans are doing or like how they're rationalizing their like utility and stuff. But I think the main thing though is that if you were to ask him like how do these like develop, he'd be like, no, you're still too focused on use.
Yeah.
So
would you say that like his kind of like claim is that industrial society, like the difference in industrial society is that is now an open question of how do we make our uselessness more useful, when that was like never really a question like, is that the differentiation that's happening, why this needs to now be addressed?
I don't think so, because
Okay.
he goes into other social examples that are radically different from each other about how you get rid of excess. But I mean, I do think
he might be claiming.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I get maybe your point is, and I think he might kind of agree with this, is that he's kind of maybe saying, like with the Aztecs, that they have a more honest conception of like uselessness and waste and sacrifice. They don't necessarily have this kind of idea of like industrial rationalization and attempt to grow the system through a rational, I guess maybe you could say that he kind of thinks industrial society is fooled, like because industrial society has a conception of economy, it makes the mistake of thinking that the end goal is to make everything useful for industrial capacity, as that's what the economy is. And his point is like, we have reached a point where we can kind of start to understand the whole, and we can start to like look at this process. But the mistake is thinking that the goal and the way our activity works is that we can like utilize everything. Whereas ancient societies, I think he thinks that maybe they have like a more accurate conception of like, you need to expend in these great things, and their society acknowledges and produces a key, like that has a key part of that, regardless of how they kind of like justify it. But they don't necessarily, I think to him, he doesn't think that they're necessarily turning it into like a kind of economic use in the way that industrial society, he would like say that we do. I don't know. That's I don't know if that's specifically how he lays it out in the like next few chapters, but I kind of feel like maybe he kind of is making a point similar to that. Like, I think he thinks there's a kind of honesty about the way that energy expenditure in his mind works that is prior to
like industrial.
Contemporary. Like, yeah.
I mean, that goes back to his like quote about ignorance, right? Where he's essentially like saying like right now, like we're undergoing stuff instead of bringing it about. I was also going back to Varn's original question about like this French conception of how things just radically change, is he leaning more into French philosophy or to like German idealism? Because I feel like I was really just literally that like line about ignorance felt like a little bit of like idealism creep.
It's Hegel, but it is not German Hegel. It is French Hegel.
Yeah.
Like it is Kojève Hegel. Like I really tell people go read those Kojève lectures because everybody in France apparently heard them, and that's where they got their ideas of Hegel from. Like not from Hegel himself.
Mm-hmm.
Like Althusser's, a lot of Althusser's responses to Hegel seem to be based on Kojève. Like it's just like things like the N-stot and stuff like that. When you go and actually look at Hegel, they're not in there at all. Like they're not conceptions Hegel actually has, but they're taught. I was taught them as things Hegel believed, and then I was like, no, that's Kojève explaining what Hegel believed. Okay, like,
one of the coolest moves, one of the coolest just biographical things about Bataille is supposedly, you know, he had all these debates with Kojève after each lecture. He would always like publish like a thing about how Kojève was wrong about this or that. But apparently there are firsthand accounts of basically Bataille would go to the lecture, fall asleep, wake up, leave, and then write. So he would just like fall asleep to Kojève and then go write a thing about how Kojève was like wrong, which I'm like, wow, Chad move, George. That's pretty cool. But just fun fact.
yeah.
So
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that reading through this, my background is in environmental sociology, and there's a lot of like rhyming with ecological type thinking that I'm seeing in this. I'm not far along in my studies as of yet, but it's just how he's trying to bring in the physics like you were brought up earlier, and how that is a key thing we are missing in our economic thinking and is a problem, you know, going forward. So to me, I saw some of that in here in the first part, and I appreciated that part of it. But yeah, I do see the problems that have been brought up, and I'm not. I'm interested to move forward and see what else he has to say. But
So I think this stuff on physics is interesting. The thing is, economists have been trying to make economics into physics the entire time it's existed. The problem with that is pretty obvious if you think about orders of complexity. Like, physics is literally the least complex thing you can study, and it's infinitely complex. So once you start going up on the scale of complexity, you have multiple infinities of complexity to deal with.
Right. I agree.
Yeah, and I don't. That to me doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about energy. Like what? Like I've in a different part of my life, I was obsessed with Technocracy Inc. For those of you who know anything about that, and they were really big on trying to figure out how to turn currency instead of labor tokens into energy expenditure tokens, and have all the energy possible in the economy equal out. So that you would not be, of course you can't destroy energy, but like you would not be destroying useful energy for useless energy, which of course Bataille would utterly hate. But I used to think a lot about it. Like I used to, try to figure out how to combine, like, because their point was labor is a form of energy. Why don't you just look at energy expenditure? But I'm like, how do you fucking quantify all different types of energy? Like, I don't even know how to do that. But anyway, but I do want to point out, like, there's a fundamental assert you pointed out earlier, Brandon, but I want to point out because it actually really hurts a point that he's making. Because, like, this is a big pillar of an argument that's in a sentence, and the sentence he states is wrong. Recent history is the result of the soaring growth of industrial activity. At the first prolific moment, restrained martial activity by absorbing the main part of the excess. The development of modern industry yielded a period of relative peace from 1815 to 1914. Not if you were not in Europe. It did not. Absolutely not. Fuck no, it didn't. Like, like everything about that statement is wrong if you're not in Europe. And I don't think it's even that true for Europe, because you have the Russian Wars of Unification, you have 1848, you have how many fucking wars were France in the 18th? I mean,
Franco-Prussian War, Italian unification. Yeah.
You also have like you have
Go ahead.
explicit like internal colonization happening like with like with England and Spain at that point, where England is actively like interfering in Spanish like domestic markets that are leading to like large scale famines on like a local level that completely like reshaped just even Europe at this time.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about, okay, and if you expand outside of Europe, then you got the Taiping Rebellion, which was probably per capita one of the most bloodiest wars in the history of humanity. Like I still remember shocked learning that more people died in the Taiping Rebellion than died in World War One.
Oh my
god. It's insane. The U.S. Civil War, the per capita bloodiest war in our history, period, like is during that time period. And then, so I'm just like, this is only true, kind of, not really, if you're only looking at Europe. And then, I don't know, I think the Franco-Prussian War is pretty fucking bloody, actually. So no, it's not even true there. Like,
is this a normal assertion? Was this a common assertion at the time? Like, where?
I've never seen it
where
before,
is he getting
honestly. That? His source is himself.
Yeah.
So
10 pages later, it's on page 35 is what his source is. And there's nothing. Cool.
All right. Which means that, like, developing this way, increasing the resources to productive forces made possible in the same period of rapid demographic expansion of the advanced countries. This is the fleshy aspect of the bony proliferation of the factories. But in the long run growth, the technical changes may possibly become difficult to sustain. It became productive and increased surplus itself. The First World War broke out before its limits were really reached, even locally. The second did not really signify that the system could not develop further, either extensively or, in the case, intensively, but waited the possibilities of a halt in development and ceased to enjoy the opportunities of growth that nothing imposed. Another problem with this is war is actually some of the most technologically productive periods of human development. And I don't like it, but it's true. So I feel like there's just I just feel like this assertion is just false, like just a flat out false. I mean, he's right in the sense that there was an increase of productive capacity, but he's not factoring into how did Europe get that productive capacity, and that's not dealt with at all. This is like a totally, and I'm not one to usually throw this word around, but this is like a totally Eurocentric view, of development right here.
How heavily does he lean on this assertion throughout the rest of it? Like, is this the argument in general?
I don't know. No, I just think it invalid. Well, I mean, we'll talk about whether the argument's valid in general, but I do think this is a big turning point for the argument, and it seems like it's bracketing something very major out. So yeah,
I don't think that specific argument really is that core, but I think it just more indicates how much this is sort of like a speculative anthropology. and a lot of his like particular case studies are probably going to hinge on him making claims about like stuff happened this way that like probably didn't obviously happen the way like he is to be like that he thinks it does in order to make his point, kind of like he's kind of doing that thing of like, on the one hand he kind of just already has this broad theory of how stuff works, and he's sort of trying to like then look at history and simultaneously claim the history like proves an example, but he's also trying to use the thing to interpret and make a narrative of the history that he thinks he's using. And I think that like that's just kind of more the issue that you have to look out for throughout the book, kind of like does this just kind of become one of those narratives where you can look at anything and just be like, well, if it happened this way, then that I'll say that it was this energy, and it's like the narrative kind of self-justifies itself, you know, if you just choose to explain things in a certain way.
Yeah, I'm curious as we continue going through this if there's a way to I want to charitably read this, like, is where I'm going with this. If there's a way to, when like this kind of stuff is pointed out, is there a way to like reformulate what he's like? Is there a way to actually get some, if he's making a pretty ahistorical claim, and that is the basis for his excess energy argument, is there a way to actually like ground that in an actual understanding of history that still is able to make that argument relevant and coherent? And that's just like an open question. I don't know if that's going to happen.
I do know that there is a book by a Bataille like scholar that claims to like try and use Bataille's like language to like discuss ecological like theories of energy and stuff. Like there are people that I've usually the people that like him are just kind of weird, but I've seen some people that seem to try and use him in a kind of a more scholarly way to like investigate like how is this guy kind of prescient in his own weird way about certain themes that would like later, like I feel like he's, I don't know, sometimes I get wary when people say like just read it because it's interesting and thought-provoking, but I feel like there is something about it that you're like he's getting at something. And I think that especially living today with like ecological stuff, it does scratch something in your brain that like you kind of got something.
Yeah, he's adjacent to something that's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's hard to know exactly how to take it. And I do think too there are questions with like discussing his stuff about like energy, especially as we go into the chapter that is about like the laws of general economy, and he talks about like, you know, the biochemical energy and stuff more. He does have a weird thing of like what like his attempt at political economy, he actually doesn't really talk about any notion of like value or profit that much. He just talks about growth and surplus. Like I don't think he ever like says like profit itself as a goal is like related. Like he just talks about growth in a sense of like actual material stuff being developed almost, which is kind of weird. But I also think that like I remember thinking, I'm not going to name names, but there's someone who occasionally talks in the Discord who I find has like a way of framing stuff that I often think almost like recreates Bataille's theory in a weird way, where they tend to go like value is energy. Like they take a Ricardian theory of value, that value is like the labor that goes directly into the product. And that's energy. So the more stuff we make, the more energy is expended in the capitalist system. But also profit is just an expression of value. So profit is like an expression of how all human energy is like put into products throughout the system. And it's one of those things that when I read it, I'm like, I don't think you actually understand what Marx is talking about, because that's not actually what Marx's theory is. But I feel like Bataille makes a similar kind of like conflation almost, where he's like acting like capitalist production is literally just about the material building of things. And like things like services and stuff are just like he says, like that's just an excess, right? Like that's a way of like unnecessary consumption.
Yeah, there's no notion here of abstract value at all.
Yeah, like there's no like clarity on like And I mean, I think we do need to deal with like capitalism still is very much tied into the creation of material things and like is constantly trying to find ways to extract resources and stuff. But like, I don't know, it makes me think of like when you read like those post-autonomous people that are like, capitalism is just about enclosing commons to build things. And it's kind of like, it's more complicated than that. Like the relationship of profit and stuff is so much more abstract. It's not just like things that you have invested energy into building per se in this like direct way, you know? And he doesn't really have that like question there.
So we've gotten through chapter 1 more or less, unless you guys see anything else. I just wanted to get on that big hinge point. And also, like, I'm not sure war is really all about the expenditure of excess resources all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't really actually believe that. But I do think if you looked at the development of things up to World War I and how World War I played out, that would be a logical deduction from that war. Even though the energy expenditure is not why it happened, but like the reason why it could go so crazy is productive forces were crazy enough that we could just like, I don't know, pump out industrial vats of mustard gas. Like, so yeah. And I want to actually, I mean, I read volume. I've actually not read all of volume 2 and 3 ever. I read volume 1 a long time ago. And it got me looking up Marcel Mauss and thinking about surplus. And I actually do think some of the points he makes about surplus driving human development are correct. And they're underexplored by Marxists. But his way of doing it is weird as fuck and maybe isn't correct. And I get whiplash as I read this book because we're constantly going from like energy as an abstraction, not even human energy, just energy total to all physics energy in the earth, right? To like contemporary society and then back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back. Like, I mean, I'll just give you an example of that. I will simply state without winding further that the extension of economic growth requires the overturning of economic principles, the overturning of the ethics that ground them. Changing from the perspective of restrictive economy to that of general economy actually accomplishes a Copernican transition, a reversal of thinking and of ethics. If a part of wealth, subject to a rough estimate, is doomed to destruction or at least to unproductive use without any possible profit, it is logical, even inescapable, to surrender commodities without return. Henceforth, leaving the pure and simple dissipation analogous to the construction of the pyramids, the possibility of pursuing growth is itself a subordinating to giving. The industrial development of the entire world demands of Americans that they uselessly grasp the necessity for an economy such as theirs of having a margin of profitless operations. An immense industrial network cannot be managed in the same way that one changes a tire. It expresses a circuit of cosmic energy on which it depends, which it cannot limit, and whose laws it cannot ignore without consequences. Woe to those who, in the end, insist on regulating movement that exceeds them with the narrow mind of a mechanic who changes a tire. So, I mean, do you see the whiplash there? Like, we're going from specific economic metaphors to, like, the movement of all energy in the world at all. Like, back and forth in the same paragraph. Like, so, yeah. Okay, the laws of general economy. So we have them, the superabundance of biochemical energy and growth, the limits of growth, pressure, the first effect of pressure, extension, the second effect of pressure, squander or luxury, and the three luxuries of nature, eating, death, and sexual reproduction. The extension through labor and technology, and the luxury of man, and the accursed share, of which the book is named. Oh, and one more thing. Opposition of the general point of view, the particular point of view. All right, those are the sub chapters, and I guess vague guidance to the rules that he is laying out here. That rule as an organism has a disposable. Let's go to the first one. The rule that an organism has a disposable greater energy resources than are necessary for the operations that sustain life, functions, activities in animals, essential muscular exercises, the search for food, is evident from the function like growth and reproduction. Neither growth nor reproduction would be possible if plants and animals did not normally dispose of excess. This very principle of living matter requires the chemical operations of life, which demand the expenditures of energy be gainful, productive, and surpluses. What do we make of that as an assertion? I mean, he gives the example of a calf and the amount of excess energy that goes into growing a calf, and how we have to castrate them to get them up, etc., etc. And then he says, in nature, there is no artificial fattening of the newborn, nor is there castration. It is convenient for me to choose a domestic animal as an example, but the movements of animal matter are basically the same in all cases. On the whole, excess energy provides the growth or the turbulence of individuals. The calf and the cow, the bull and the ox merely add richer and more familiar illustration of the great movement. Plants manifest the same excess, but in much more pronounced in their case. They are nothing but growth and reproduction. The energy necessary for their functional activity is negligible, but it is an indefinite exuberance that must be considered in relation to the conditions that make it possible and limit it. This has like no notion of metabolism whatsoever in it. Which I also found interesting. What do you guys make of that? Apparently not a lot.
I think it's just hard to like. It's one of those things where it points out like what his notion of excess is. Like he has this, it's like excess relative to a general system, but like I don't know, like being like the growth and reproduction of the thing is relative to its like excess as an individual system. I'm like, I don't know, like if that's like an obvious, like great way to frame this in terms of like the movement of energy. Like I feel like there's other ways that you can claim to talk about the energy as like excessive or not.
Yeah, I find it weird, honestly.
Do biological systems like already have an equilibrium of this kind of which to be in excess of? Like is kind of maybe not as obvious in our contemporary understandings of like biological systems than maybe some of these like 20th century conceptions.
Right.
Like obviously you can be in like caloric excess or whatever, where like your body will store up like fat or like, you know, not use the protein to build like muscle or something. But in either case, those are like kinds of like growth, you know, like.
I don't know if too abstracted is the word, but like specifically in this section, I felt like the frustration I feel when anarchists talk about power, where I'm like, what? I think we're bringing this out like almost too far to the point where there's like no specificity, and we're just kind of like making this blanket term that can mean essentially everything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what is the definition of power? The ability to do work or the ability to force a change, right? Like, which, I mean, I mean, in some ways, like, yes, that's everything. To be fair, Marxists do this too. Not so much with power, but the way Marxists talk about class struggle sometimes, that I'm like, so class struggle is when classes do things, even if they're not opposed at any, like, but anyway. Then we get to the limits of growth section, which I was expecting because because we hear about this all the time today, right? I was expecting something completely different than what we got. But that's my late 20th century, early 21st century bias, not Bataille's. I will speak briefly about the most general condition of life, dwelling on the crucial important facts. Solar energy is the source of life's exuberant development. The origin and essence of our wealth is given in the radiation of the sun, which dispenses energy, wealth without any return. It's a weird way to talk about wealth. I just gotta the sun gives without ever receiving. Men were conscious of this long before astrophysics measured the ceaseless prodigality. They saw it ripen the harvest and associated a splendor with the act of someone who gives without receiving. It is necessary at this point to note the dual origin of moral judgments. In formal times, value was given to unproductive glory, whereas in our day it is given in measures of production. Precedence is given to energy acquisition over energy expenditure. Glory itself is justified by the consequences of the glorious deed in the sphere of utility. But dominated though it is by the practical judgments in Christian morality, the archaic sensibility is still alive. In particular, it reappears in the romantic protest against the bourgeois world. Only in the classical consumptions of the economy does it lose its rights entirely. Solar radiation results in superabundance of energy on the surface of the globe. But first, living matter receives this energy and accumulates it within the limits given by the space that is available to it. It then radiates or squanders it before devoting an appreciable share to this radiation. It makes maximum use for its growth. Hence, the impossibility of continuing growth makes way for squander. Hence, the real excess does not begin until the growth of the individual or group has reached its limits. The immediate limitation for each individual or each group is given by other individuals or other groups, but the terrestrial sphere, or to be exact, the biosphere, which corresponds to the space available to life, is the only real limit. The individual or group can be reduced by another individual or group, but the total volume of living nature has not changed. In short, it is the size of terrestrial space that limits the overall growth. Is that true?
Theoretically, no.
Yeah, I was like, I feel like we've actually lost a lot of life in the last 30 years that hasn't been replaced with anything. I don't mean human life, although human life is also significantly slowing its growth even in the developing world. So, yeah.
There is also just... Oh, wait, no, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say, but the biological growth we create for our own use is actually going up because we're, raising more cattle and things like this around the world. So, we humans and our biological, food take up more and more space, more and more of the planet's resources than ever before by a fair amount. I'm trying to remember what it is, 2/3 of all biological life by weight is based on human consumption and humans themselves, something like that.
So, I mean, but do we see this as a steady state as stated here? I guess I do actually see the point here, because there is life in that we're growing a ton of food, which is living. Like, our food is alive. We don't eat rocks. Be cool if we did. Actually, probably wouldn't be cool if we did, actually. We'd eventually. Anyway, be bad to eat your own planet. But nonetheless, you kind of get my point. I'm not sure that it actually works out as cleanly as he's trying to state here. I just don't know. I don't even know how I would know either.
There's a weird paradox to his thinking where, for someone who's all about disruptive materialism and everything's like there's contingencies and stuff, there's this nascent there is this weird sense of there's an equilibrium that stuff maintains that's not fully like explicated. Like I guess you could like I feel like maybe he would say like part of like reframing this as he'd be like, well, if the conditions of the biosphere of the Earth change, then like yes, the total mass of like bioorganic energy that can be sustained might change. So it can go up or down if like the nature of the Earth and the terrestrial like capacities it has change. But his point is that like it's always going to life itself is always going to try and like equilibrium out where whenever there's death, life is already working to like fill in the death. Like the luxuriousness of death is filled in with the luxuriousness of energy, like expanding through growth or whatever. Is like I think like what his like comeback would possibly be like.
And it feels like dark evil hippie Gaia hypothesis.
Well, yeah, I think that was the vibe I was generally picking up. And that kind of like made me go back and reread it and get into like kind of like nitpicky, where it's talking about like the sun providing energy and like getting nothing in return. I was like, well, and I feel like this is justified given like kind of the surrealist and mystical nature of Bataille generally. And I can see him using this as an example in a different work somewhere else. Like he never did, but I can just see like this logic of being like, well, the sun does give us energy for a limited period of time and then it eats us. Like it's literally like through that giving us of that energy is eventually just going to like destroy the entire world at one point.
Right.
He does have a poem called The Solar Anus from early on that's also about his sun worship and how the sun just like expels. But I don't know. I don't know if he talks about like supernovas or something, but
yeah, it's a little bit of a side tangent, but I was just like,
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think he would maybe be like, is that really, I don't know if he would think that's outside of his like point though, that like eventually it just has like an ultimate excess and the energy just like goes into another thing. Yeah, like it just sacrifices and like deals away with this. I don't know.
Yeah. All right, we get to the section on pressure. As a result, the surface of the globe is invested by life to the extent possible. By and large, the myriads of forms of life adopt it to available resources are so that space is its basic limit. The local conditions determine and I'm skipping parts because I don't want to read all this. The local conditions determine the intensity of the pressure exerted in all directions by life. But one can speak of pressure in this sense only if, by some means, the available space is increased. This space will be immediately occupied in the same way as the adjoining space. Moreover, the same is true every time life is destroyed at some point on the globe by forest fire, by volcanic phenomenon, or by the hand of man. The most familiar example of that is the path of the gardener clears and maintains. Once abandoned, the pressure of the surrounding life soon covers it again with weeds and bushes swarming with animal life. If the path is paved with asphalt, it is for a long time sheltered from the pressure, but this means that the volume of life possible, assuming that the path were abandoned instead of being covered with asphalt, would not be realized, that the additional energy corresponding to this volume is lost, is dissipated in some way. This pressure cannot be compared to that of a closed boiler. If space is completely occupied, if there is no outlet anymore, nothing bursts, but the pressure is there. Skip ahead. The consequences of this situation do not easily enter into our calculations. We calculate our interest, but this situation baffles us. The very word interest is contradictory with the desire at stake under these conditions. As soon as we want to act reasonably, we have to consider the utility of our actions. Utility implies an advantage, a maintenance, or growth. Now, if it is necessary to respond to exuberance, it is no doubt possible to use it for growth, but the problem raised precludes this. Supposing there is no longer any growth possible, what is to be done with the seething energy that remains? To waste it is obviously not to use it, and yet what we have is draining away a pure and simple loss, which occurs in any case. From the first, the excess energy, if it cannot be used for growth, is lost. Moreover, in no way can the inevitable loss be accounted useful. It is only a matter of acceptable loss, preferring to another that is regarded as unacceptable, a question of acceptability, not utility. The consequences are decisive, however. What do we make of that?
I mean, the pressure theory is what you mentioned earlier about like the kind of vulgar Marxist understanding of like war creating new markets.
Mm-hmm.
Like quite literally, it's like, yeah, when humans bomb or destroy a place, there's going to be pressure to then like resubsume that place. And it's like less conspiratorial, of course, but it's still.
It's less conspiratorial, more vitalist.
Yeah, yeah.
Any other things that we can just move on? You guys are like, yeah, this is weird. All right. The very first effect of pressure, extinction. I mean, I find it interesting, but we are taking huge leaps here because we go from extinction to the second expression, squander or luxury. All right. Like that's okay. Anyway, it is hard to define and precisely represent the pressure thus extended. It is both complex and elusive, but one can describe its effects. An image comes to mind, then I must say offering it illustrates the consequences, yet does not give a concrete idea of the cause. Imagine an immense crowd assembled in the expectation of witnessing a bullfight that will take place in a bull ring that is too small. The crowd wants badly to enter, but cannot entirely be accommodated. Many people must wait outside. Similarly, the possibilities of life cannot be realized infinitely and definitely. They are limited by space, just as the entry of the crowd is limited by the number of seats in the bull ring. A first effect of the pressure will be to increase the number of seats in the bull ring. If security services is well organized, the number is limited precisely, but outside there may be trees or lampposts from the top of which of the arena is visible. If there is no regulation against it, there will be people who climb these trees and lampposts. Similarly, I would like to call this the Woodstock theory of extinction. Similarly, the earth opens up to life at the primary space of waters in the surface of the ground, but life quickly takes possession of the air. To start with, it is important to enlarge the surface of green substance of plants, which absorbs the radiant energy of light. The superposition of leaves in the air extends the volume of the substance considerably. In particular, the structure of trees develop this possibility well beyond the level of the grasses. For their part, the winged insects and the birds in the wake of pollen invade the air. Again, whiplash. I'm going back and forth between levels of existence like so rapidly. But yeah. Do we have anything to say on that? Nope. Okay, good.
It's overly simplified, but like I don't think he's entirely wrong.
No, it's not totally wrong.
Here,
Mm-hmm.
like it's like, yeah, dated, but the gist of it is kind of true. Like
this one doesn't make me mad. It more just confuses me. All right, so that brings us to the second effect of pressure, squander or luxury. But the lack of room can have another effect. A fight may break out at the entrance. Told you, the Woodstock theory of pressure. If lives are lost, the excess of individuals over the number of seats will decrease. I don't know why I find that so fucking funny, but anyway. The effect works in the sense contrary to the first one. Sometimes the pressure results in the clearing of new space. Other times it results in the erasing of possibilities in excess of the available room. The last effect operates in nature in the most varied forms. The most remarkable is death. There's this weird tendency in Bataille to like try to tie into political economy a theodicy around death. Like seriously, and I think that's an interesting thing to notice because like Marx is not trying to explain why there like death exists in the world. Like, anyway, as we know, death is not necessary. Do we know that?
That was wild.
It's just like feels to me necessary.
It's like, well, this is part of the vitalism too, right? Like this is like
Right.
huge vitalism seeping and going like, well, atoms don't die, so we don't have to die technically.
Yeah.
Depends what you mean.
I mean,
by
I don't know that
us.
he's necessarily saying that individuals don't like that any individual organism has the potential to not die. I think he's just saying like he's just trying to be like from the most like broad standpoint, like we could just have a world that's all on like this a particular undying type of life, and that could be it, like kind of thing. But yeah, it's from the standpoint of energy, you don't need death to expel things, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, in that sense,
That's
it's
fair,
true,
yeah.
but it's a crazy statement.
It's a great badass line to just drop in your book of political economy. In the long run, we're all dead, Keynes? I don't think so.
Yeah, I just want to hear someone talk about Keynes, and he goes, "As we know, death is not necessary. Just leave the room." The simple forms of life are immortal. The birth of an organism reproduced through parity is lost in the midst of time. Indeed, it cannot be said that to have had parents. For example, the doubles A and A apostrophe and A double apostrophe result from the splitting of 2A. A has not ceased living with the coming of the being A apostrophe. A apostrophe is still A, and the same is true of A apostrophe apostrophe. So let us suppose, and this is purely theoretical for the purpose of demonstration, that in the beginning of life there was just one of these infinitesimal creatures. It would have nonetheless have quickly populated the earth with its species. After a short time, in theory, reproduction would have become impossible for the lack of room, and the energy it utilizes would have dissipated in the form of heat. Moreover, this is what happens to one of the microorganisms, duckweed, which covers the pond with green film, after which it remains in equilibrium. For duckweed, space is given within the narrowly determined limits of the pond, but the stagnation of the duckweed is not conceivable on the scale of the entire globe, where in any case the necessary equilibrium is lacking. It can be granted theoretically that the pressure everywhere equal to itself would result in the state of rest and the general substitution of heat loss for reproduction, but real pressures has different results. It puts unequal organisms in competition with one another. And although we cannot say how the species takes part in the dance, how the species takes part in the dance, we can say what the dance is. Beside the external action of life, climatic or volcanic phenomena, the unevenness of pressure and living matter continually makes them available to growth, the place left vacant by death. So basically, stuff dies because we need room. All right. I insist on the fact that there's generally no growth, but only a luxurious squandering of energy in every form. The history of life on Earth is mainly the effect of wild abundance. The dominant event is the development of luxury, the production of increasingly burdensome forms of life. So luxury here means more and more complicated life, I guess. There is both
more complicated ways of wasting energy.
Yeah. Well, more complicated life, which is a more complicated way of wasting energy. I suppose we have to note that there's both an equilibrium and a teleology to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting to note. We are almost done with this. No, we're not. This is another. I gotta say, some of these lines are pretty cool. I might think some of them are.
That last
bullshit,
paragraph is pretty badass.
We got another one.
Drop that in a long noise rock out track. Just drop that in at the recording at the beginning, and then play.
This is another one you could put in an industrial album. The eating of one species by another is the simplest form of luxury. Like that. The populations that were trapped by the German army acquired, thanks to fuel shortage, a vulgarized knowledge of this burdensome character of the indirect development of living matter. If one cultivates potatoes or wheat, the land yields in consumable calories and much greater than that of livestock and milk and meat for the equivalent acreage of pasturage. The least burdensome form of life is that of green microorganisms, absorbing the sun's energy through the action of chlorophyll. But generally, vegetation is less burdensome than animal life. Vegetation quickly occupies available space. Animals make it a field of slaughter. Think of all the dead carrots. This feels like it could have been in the back of a Tool album. And extend its possibilities in this way. They themselves develop more slowly. In this respect, the wild beast is at a summit. Its continual deprivations of the deep predators represents an immense squandering of energy. William Blake asked the tiger, "In what distant deeps are skies burn in the fire of thine eyes?" What struck him in this way was the cruel pressure at the limits of possibility of the tiger's immense power of consumption of life. Eating breaks death, but even in accidental form. All conceivable luxuries, death in its fatal and example form is undoubtedly the most costly. That's a weird way to think about death. And I'm also not sure that it is the most costly, but we can come back. I'm really not sure how I'd measure that.
I think rather than him asserting that death isn't necessary as biology exists right this moment, I think he was maybe saying maybe death doesn't have to happen. Maybe there could have been, an evolutionary path where creatures didn't die. And if that's what he's saying, then that actually makes a lot of sense here. That, death would be a big waste.
Yeah. But it's a weird form of waste to think of as a luxury. I mean, I know that this is one of these shocking inversions of what the word means normally. But yeah.
Right.
I mean, because the hard thing with Bataille is that whenever he talks about like waste and stuff, he's not necessarily saying that he wants to not have the waste.
Yeah.
Like he thinks that the waste is kind of the driver to like things.
So Bataille pro coal rolling. Anyway.
Because later down on here, he starts talking about how like we shouldn't be afraid of death and stuff in like the typical way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's in reality. We only when we curse death, we only fear ourselves. The severity of our will is what makes us tremble. We lie to ourselves when the dream of escaping the moment of luxurious exuberance, of which we are only the most intense form. I mean, he did try to talk a secret society into cutting his head off. I'm just gonna I've been reading Bataille's biography, and I'm really not trying to psychoanalyze this from what I know from that, but holy fucking shit, is that guy weird? And I don't normally say stuff like that, but I was just like,
is it the Verso Books one?
Yeah, the one from French, the Sura.
Yeah,
one. I learned way too much about his responses to his mom's death in ways I don't want to talk about on air because it might get my episode pulled down. It's just bizarre. But I say that to say that I actually think he had the courage of his weird ass convictions here. That's my point. Like he did really mean this. This is not just a thought experiment. Okay.
This is also where we see his conflation of death and sexuality.
Yeah. Although, I mean, is there anything more French?
Is there anything more French?
I mean, fucking orgasm in French is called the little death. I don't know what else we're playing out here. Like,
But
this is not
mostly
helping.
just that, again, he just takes it further than most in his convictions about that.
Yeah.
I mean, his main competitor would probably be like Desaad,
Right.
like also a French guy.
Notice the nationality. No.
Yeah.
Anyway, under present conditions, independently of our consciousness, sexual reproduction is, together with eating and death, one of the most luxurious detours that ensures the intense consumption of energy. To begin with, it accentuates the socioparity announced, the division by which the individual being forgoes growth for himself, and through the multiplication of individuals transfers it to an impersonal, to the impersonality of life. That is because from the first, sexuality differs from miserly growth. If with regard to the species, sexuality appears as growth, in principle, it nevertheless is the luxury of individuals. This characteristic is more accentuated in sexual reproduction, where individuals are clearly separate from those that engender them and give them life as one gives to others. But without renouncing a subsequent return to the principle of growth for the period of nutrition, reproduction of the higher animals has not ceased to deepen the fault that separates it from the simple tendency to eat in order to increase volume and power. For these animals, sexual reproduction is the occasion of sudden and frantic squandering of energy resources, carried in a moment to the limiting of possibility in time what the tiger is in space. The squandering goes far beyond what would have been sufficient for the growth of the species. It appears to be that the most of the individual has the strength to accomplish in the given moment. It leads to wholesale destruction of property and spirit, the destruction of bodies as well, and ultimately connects up with the sensuous luxury and excesses of death. Cool. We have kids, so more things can die and get rid of more energy. Extension through labor and technology and the luxury of man. I'm just going to skip to the end because I think this is pretty clear. Thus, man is only a roundabout subsidiary response to the problem of growth. Doubtless, through labor and technique, he has made possible an extension of growth beyond the given limits. But just as an herbivore relative to the plant and the carnivore relative to the herbivore is a luxury, man is the most suited of all living beings to consume intensely, sumptuously, the excess energy offered up by the pressure of life to the congregation benefits of the solar origins of the moment. I feel like, perversely, Bataille may have celebrated our mass extinction event that we're currently living through. Like, in a weird way. Like, that is the implication of that line. Like, because we have the ability to extend our energy through technology and labor, we also have the ability to consume more and die and kill more stuff and die better. That's the argument here. And then we get to the section the book is named after, the Accursed Share. And I'll just read the whole thing because this is actually important. Truth is paradoxical to the Bataille likes paradoxes for fucking sure. To the extent of being exactly contrary to the usual perception. This paradoxical character is underscored by the fact that even at the highest point of exuberance, its significance is still veiled. Under present conditions, everything conspires to obscure the basic movement that tends to restore wealth to its function, to gift giving, to the squandering without reciprocation. On one hand, mechanized warfare producing its ravages characterizes this movement as something alien, hostile to the human will. On the other hand, raising the standard of living is in no way represented as a requirement of luxury. The movement that demands it is even a protest against the luxury of the great fortunes. Thus, the demand made in the name of justice. Without having anything against justice, obviously, one might be allowed to point out that here the word conceals the profound truth of its contrary, which is precisely freedom. Under the mask of justice, it is true that general freedom takes on a lackluster and neutral appearance of existence subjected to the necessities. If anything, it is a narrowing limit to what is most just. It is not a dangerous breaking loose, a meaning the word has lost. It is a guarantee against risk of servitude not a will which to resume risk, without which there is no freedom. What do we make of that?
I don't know if there is an actual like etymological justification for when he claims that justice meant like a breaking free, unless he's just making an appeal to like the justice of freeing people. Because like all I've been able to find is it means like administration of law or something
Right.
boring like that.
Yeah, actually, let's do a little etymology.
Let's see, justice, Latin justita, expressing, quote, the condition of being, the quality of being justus.
It just means right, but comes from oh, it's interesting. Justus is derived from isus, which means right, and comes from the Proto-Indo-European name, which means life force. The word justice first appeared in the 12th century. The word judge has a similar meaning to justice and also comes from Latin from us, but the two words entered English at different times and are constructed with different suffixes. The earliest record of justice being used to describe as official in 1172 French biography of Thomas Becket, which refers to the judge and service of the King of France. Yeah, it just seems to mean from Anglo-Saxon approximations of Latin, administration of law, but it does seem to have some root to like administration of life, maybe. I don't know. It sounds very Foucauldian to me, but I also, should I really take that we understand what Proto-Indo-European names really were and what they meant? Like, but anyway, because we don't even agree what people they were. But yeah, I think he just may have made up an etymology. A long tradition of people doing that. Plato started it long ago. So, you know.
I did highlight like this section a lot more just because I thought it was interesting that he just drops again, like, because early on he kind of says something about how like this is like a work of like ethics sort of, and then he just like drops this here where he's like, our whole like orientation is towards like this notion of justice that's not right because it's all about like limiting ourselves to some specific idea of like these things are just and they'll shield us from like danger and stuff, but instead we need a conception that allows us to like explode our bounds and embrace chance, which is a big theme with him, is like chance. And if I remember correctly, a lot of his other work does talk about justice. I know that Blanchot, his friend, really got big into writing about justice and the paradoxes of it, and he justifies a lot of it by pointing to Bataille. But like, I kind of don't. I feel like it's another one of those things where he kind of never says what he means by it. But he, you know, like he'll talk about like the guillotine and justice and the killing and the sacrifice and stuff, you know. But it was just kind of interesting seeing him like explicate that a little bit in the middle of this bigger section where it just stands out, kind of.
Yeah,
I think this is going back a little bit from the justice, going up to the under the present conditions part of the paragraph. But I think he makes a movement where he says the basic movement that tends to restore wealth to its function, to gift giving. Had he made that claim earlier, or was this the first time that he was making that claim? That like the like lowest order of like excess energy is gift. Like, what do we do with excess energy? Like the lowest order of that is gift giving. Like, is that just like comparing it back to the sun?
I think he's just using gift giving to like then qualify squandering without reciprocation. Like the core thing is squandering without expecting anything in return is like, and he's just putting in gift giving, which is going to be one of his anthropological core examples.
What do we make of the line, the standard of living is no way represented as a requirement of luxury? I think this sort of gets back into some of his questionable economic ideas in terms of like, okay, what's propelling growth? And by luxury here, I assume that it's like things that he was talking about in terms of like deficit and everything like that, right? So those are two separate, but then they become two separate tracks. Like, I don't know how that all fits together.
Oh, he talks about this at the end of the chapter too. I think his point is that people are wrong when they say like, before we start giving stuff away to people, we've got to like produce a bunch more and get them working and then give them like a standard of living. Like, and he's like, no, we should just give the shit. Like, give away the wealth. Like, we don't need to like raise this gradual standard from what we already have, I think is what he's claiming.
Yeah, basically,
like,
gift giving is cool. Like, it gets rid of energy,
like
it makes us feel good.
I think he's trying to make the claim of like, we don't need some sort of like quantitative increase in like production and like our material subsistence as it is now in order to like let people live luxuriously through like the excess use of like the goods we already make kind of thing in the system.
Well, I'm trying to keep his definitions in my head. His understanding of luxury is essentially like complicating, making more complex ways to get rid of energy. Right?
Yeah.
And so
more
I don't
complex or more elaborate or more abundant. Yeah.
Raising the standard of living, I think you could all just like, I think those are like two. I read that as he's making the distinction of like raising the standard of living could actually lead, at the way we understand the standard of living, has nothing like, that's decoupled from what we're talking about with luxury. Because I mean, you can raise the standard of living without like increasing the complexity of like getting rid of energy.
Yeah.
Right? Like
maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I'm getting a little bit of whiplash at this point.
No, there's a ton of whiplash in this book.
I'm just thinking about the way that he talks later on down, where he's like talking about like, if India has problems in its economy, the solution is we give them a bunch of America's excess wealth. And like,
okay.
And we don't ask for anything for it at all.
And you just give it. Them. And that's the like, and he says in a part, like at the end of the chapter, skip ahead a little bit, we're only a few pages off. Like he's talking about like the issue of the current like crisis of the world and like where it might be going. And he has this part where he says, quote, like, it must be stated as a principle without hesitation that the lifting of such a curse depends on man and only on man, but it cannot be lifted if the movement from which it emanates does not appear clearly in consciousness. In this regard, it seems rather disappointing to have nothing more to propose as a remedy for the catastrophe that threatens than the, quote, raising of the living standard, quote. This recourse, as I have said, is linked to our refusal to see in its truth the exigency to which the recourse is intended to respond. And I think that he is trying to like kind of say like it's a wrong-headed technocratic move to think that we need to somehow like increase the living standard in this kind of like productive quantitative sense versus look clearly at our capacities to just give excess energy in our productive system away already. And have that be the core drive to like deal with our to him, like the raising the standard of living is just as likely to produce the problem that's going to generate war. Whereas the real solution is figure out what can you do to just destroy and get rid of this stuff that isn't going to be war.
That's really helpful, actually. That was really clarifying.
Yeah. So this is a good place to wrap up for today. And well, I actually do think Bataille gets clearer and weirder when we talk about his examples, like that aren't just like when we talk about his like historical examples. But I just want to note that I think this is a rational argument for irrationalism to court. Like, it's an argument against any form of rationalization.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and sometimes the logic is gonna strike us as grotesque, and sometimes it's gonna feel weirdly hippie-ish at the same time. It's very strange. It's like if your hippies were also like, if your hippies were the Manson cult, that's kind of Bataille, except he never actually killed anybody. But
less race war.
Yeah, less race war too. Yes.
Yeah.
Although that space, you got to keep that space. You know, those, so it's an interesting place to be. The more I read Bataille, I get why I was into him as a weirdo artist in my 20s who was a weird poet who wrote a lot about sex and death. But I don't get why people find him important for political economy. But I also don't feel like this is so crazy I can just write it off. It has like it feels lucid, but in a very unlucid way. I don't know how to explain it. Like, I'm like, no, I'm following the logic, kind of, but yeah. And I do feel like there's like, this is actually more ambitious than any, like when we talk about political, it feels more ambitious than political economy. This is like, these are rules of all life forever and ever. Amen. Like our economy works the same way the way plants and do, etc. In a way, which, you know, I think most Marxists would like start scratching and breaking out in hives when they hear that kind of thing. So it's interesting to read about. How are you guys enjoying this so far? I find it easy to read and hard to understand.
Yep.
This discussion was actually super helpful, just to like clarify a couple questions where I'm just like scratching my head and rereading the paragraph over and over again.
Yeah, and not in the way that I read, like, I don't know, a Badiou paragraph over and over again, because I'm trying to figure out exactly what he means by scission, but in the way that I read something where I go, wait, what? There must be a step of the logic I missed somewhere. Where is it? Like, but anyway, go ahead. Anyone else speak? Speak.
Oh, yeah, this conversation's been great. This is the third time that I've read this book, and
you read it one more time than me. So
yeah, so I read it once, like, oh God, that was like 20 years ago when I was like in my early 20s, and then I read it again like during sort of COVID stuff when all I could do was read, and then and then this time. And yeah, I do think the project is a legitimately wacky, interesting idea that feels like it's just more or less trying to come up with a unified theory of everything, or trying to explain the universe, which is very obviously kooky and very ambitious, but it does make for a fun read.
Yeah, I kind of feel like this is the Bataille's like most interesting crank, you know. I mean, except we don't know him.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I certainly feel like he's the kind of guy that I've hung out with who, at some point in the night, it's like, well, the deal with the true nature of reality is...
we need human sacrifice. But we should also just give our shit to India.
Yeah.
Well, it's I think given the time, it's very Marshall Plan brain.
He has a chapter on the Marshall Plan.
Totally.
He really does.
Yeah, yeah, literally.
I would like to get into more like what he thinks the equilibrium actually is, though, because this equilibrium stuff actually, like, I was taught that all life saw equilibrium in biology way back, and then I actually studied a lot of biology and realized that's total bullshit. like, um, like the tendency towards equilibrium is actually a tendency towards stasis, and the tendency towards stasis is death. So that just doesn't actually seem to work. But he uses that stuff in a weird way, as if there's an equilibrium point that like all this stuff is excess of. And it gives it a weird, almost not like ethical valence that's I think what you were identifying, PH, when you said like cybernetic theorists wouldn't know what to do with this, because even though he's talking about systems in this quasi-cybernetic way, there's a human centricness that also seems to be about ethics and stuff that they reject.
I think as my like final closing thoughts before I need to head out here, like I think what's kind of interesting is that there is this like weird sort of equilibrium that he has, because he's like, you need the limits of the system and stuff that the excess is like working around. But he's also still trying to kind of make this point about how like everything kind of works towards the equilibrium, and then that breaks everything down, and like it deteriorates and kind of like shifts and reappears. Like he's not really trying to say like things can just actually reach a point of like stability. He's just saying that like with purpose, like for growth, there's like this point where stuff has to then reach like waste. And so it's a weird like thing. And I think, and in a way, I think the charm of this with its bizarreness is that like, you know, like it's so weird and bold and out there that it's a nice little like just antidote for like, if you're someone who you've like really read a bunch of Marx and you're like, yes, I understand everything there is to know about the economy, and I know how, using the label theory of value, I'm going to like plan a perfect society where there's no like waste and everything's good. Like reading this, like he has enough insights to just kind of give you a kick in your pants and be like, did you really think of this? Like, what about this aspect of it, bud? Like, you're not thinking about waste in this kind of more like the weird way. And it gives you a little bit of that, like, yeah, maybe I don't like you can't be too confident that you can explain everything in society, because his all trying to explain everything in society is fragmentary and weird and kind of partially about how crazy and insane it all is. And I kind of like that about it. Like, I don't think he like disproves Marx or like disproves this or that. Like, even I don't even think he like outright is systemic enough to like disprove like bourgeois economics, aside from just kind of pointing out anthropologically like it maybe doesn't make sense. But like it's not like that rigorous, but it's good at just kind of like making you feel a little uncomfortable in a way that I don't think is too bad if you're used to being a theory head who thinks that they've got it all figured out in a way.
The taking concepts to the absolute like unimaginable extreme, the absurd extreme, and watching everything kind of collapse it on itself.
Yeah, but I've got to head out, so I hope I didn't like dominate the conversation too much. I am a bit of a Bataille guy, so I know a little bit, but I also don't want to like make it be like I understand exactly what he's talking about, because he also just doesn't make sense. So
right,
but
yeah.
Good talking with everybody.
Good talking to you guys. Bye bye.
Thank